Most people think arguing means raising your voice, proving someone wrong, or landing the perfect comeback. But that's not how real power works. In real life, the people who always win arguments are rarely the loudest. They're the calmest. They don't react. They respond. They don't chase validation. They control the direction of the conversation. Today, you're going to learn how to argue like a lawyer, not to attack people, but to protect yourself, to stay in control, and to never get emotionally trapped in someone else's chaos. Because the moment you stay calm, you already have the upper hand. Staying calm is not about being quiet or passive. It is about being in control of yourself when everything inside you wants to react. When someone raises their voice, makes an accusation, or tries to provoke you, your nervous system immediately goes into defense mode. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing changes, and your mind starts racing to protect your image, your pride, or your truth. That reaction feels natural, but it is also exactly what gives the other person power over you. The moment you get loud, emotional, or rushed, you are no longer choosing your words. They are choosing them for you. Calmness keeps you in the driver's seat of the conversation because when you are calm, you are thinking, and when you are thinking, you are in control. People often believe that the louder person is the stronger one, but in reality, the calmer person holds the most authority. When you speak slowly, clearly, and without emotional spikes, it sends a signal that you are not threatened. That steadiness forces the other person to adjust to you instead of the other way around. When someone comes at you with anger or accusations, and you respond with a steady tone and relaxed posture, it disrupts their strategy. They were expecting resistance, not composure. They were expecting a fight, not a grounded presence. That contrast alone changes the entire dynamic of the argument. Remaining calm also protects you from saying things you cannot take back. In heated moments, people often blurt out exaggerations, insults, or defensive justifications that weaken their position. Once words are out, you cannot pull them back, and they often become the very thing used against you later. Calmness gives you the space to choose your words intentionally instead of emotionally. It allows you to listen fully instead of preparing your next attack while the other person is speaking. When you are calm, you hear not just what they say, but what they mean, and that gives you valuable information about how to respond. There is also something deeply unsettling about someone who refuses to be pulled into emotional chaos. When you stay calm while the other person is worked up, you become a mirror that reflects their behavior back to them. They become more aware of how they sound, how intense they look, and how unstable their argument feels. Your calmness becomes a form of quiet pressure that pushes them to either lower their tone or lose credibility. The more grounded you remain, the more their emotional outbursts stand out, and the less convincing their argument becomes. Listening to understand instead of listening to win is one of the most powerful shifts you can make in any argument. Most people enter conversations already preparing their response before the other person has even finished speaking. They are not really listening, they are just waiting for their turn to talk. When you listen that way, you miss important details, you misinterpret intentions, and you often end up arguing against something that was never truly said. Real listening means giving the other person your full attention, not because you agree with them, but because understanding their position gives you leverage in the conversation. When you truly listen, you start to hear the structure of their argument. You notice where they are certain and where they are guessing. You hear what they repeat, which reveals what matters most to them. You catch the emotional triggers behind their words, whether it is fear, insecurity, frustration, or a need to feel respected. This kind of listening turns a heated exchange into a map. It shows you where to step carefully and where to apply pressure. Instead of guessing what they mean, and that knowledge allows you to respond in a way that is precise rather than reactive. People also behave differently when they feel heard. Even if they disagree with you, being listened to lowers their defenses. It slows them down. It makes them more open to considering another perspective. When someone feels ignored or talked over, they escalate, but when they feel understood, they soften. This gives you space to guide the conversation instead of fighting it. You are no longer pushing against them, you are walking alongside them, and that is where influence comes from. Listening to understand also protects you from being manipulated. When you listen carefully, you notice contradictions, exaggerations, and emotional hooks designed to provoke you. You can separate what is factual from what is emotional. You can tell when someone is deflecting or avoiding responsibility. Instead of getting pulled into their narrative, you stay grounded in what is actually being said. This keeps you from arguing about side issues or getting dragged into unnecessary conflict. There is also a quiet confidence in letting someone fully express themselves before you respond. It shows that you do not need to rush, that you are not afraid of their words, and that you trust your ability to handle whatever comes next. When you finally speak, your words carry more weight because they are informed by what you truly heard, not by assumptions or emotional guesses, and that makes your response sharper, calmer, and far more effective in shaping the direction of the conversation. Asking strategic questions instead of making accusations changes the entire power dynamic of a conversation. Accusations immediately put the other person on the defensive. The moment you say you did this or you always do that, their nervous system shifts into protection mode. And once that happens, logic leaves the room. They stop listening, they stop thinking clearly, and all they care about is defending their image. Questions, on the other hand, do the opposite. They invite explanation instead of resistance. They slow the conversation down and force the other person to think rather than react. A well-placed question acts like a spotlight. It brings attention to something without directly attacking it. Instead of saying, "You're being unfair," you ask, "What makes this feel fair to you?" Instead of "You're lying," you ask, "Can you help me understand how that fits with what you said earlier?" These kinds of questions are calm, but they are powerful. They require the other person to clarify their position, and when people have to explain themselves, weaknesses start to show. They either become more reasonable or they expose contradictions in their own story. Questions also shift the burden of proof. When you make an accusation, you now have to defend it. When you ask a question, they have to justify their answer. That subtle shift gives you control over the direction of the conversation. You are no longer trying to convince them of anything. You are inviting them to reveal their thinking. The more they talk, the more information you gain, and information is what allows you to respond intelligently instead of emotionally. There is also something disarming about curiosity. When you ask questions with a calm tone, it makes it harder for the other person to paint you as hostile or unreasonable. You come across as someone who is trying to understand, even if your questions are challenging. That lowers their guard and makes them more likely to speak honestly. And when people speak honestly, they often say more than they intended, which gives you insight into their true motivations and priorities. Strategic questions also keep you from getting trapped in pointless arguments. Instead of going back and forth over who is right or wrong, you guide the conversation toward clarity. You are not throwing punches, you are setting traps of logic. Each answer they give either supports their position or weakens it, and you did not have to raise your voice or make a single accusation to get there. The conversation becomes less about emotional conflict and more about understanding what is really happening beneath the surface, which is where real influence is created and where real resolution begins to take shape through calm. Deliberate inquiry, sticking to facts instead of feelings, is what separates a controlled argument from an emotional explosion. Feelings are real, but they are not always reliable when it comes to proving a point. When you argue from emotions, the conversation quickly becomes about who feels more hurt, more offended, or more misunderstood, and that kind of argument never truly ends because feelings shift from moment to moment. Facts, however, are stable. They give the conversation something solid to stand on. When you ground your words in what actually happened, you remove a lot of the confusion and defensiveness that comes from emotional interpretation. Most conflicts become messy because people describe their feelings as if they were facts. Saying something like, "You disrespected me," is really an emotional experience, not an objective event. The other person may not agree with that interpretation, and now you are arguing about perception instead of reality. But when you say, "You interrupted me 3 times while I was speaking," you are pointing to something concrete that can be observed and acknowledged. That shifts the discussion from a personal attack to a specific behavior, which is much easier to address and change. When you use facts, you also protect yourself from being pulled into someone else's emotional storm. If the other person is angry, defensive, or dramatic, staying focused on what actually happened keeps you anchored. You are not denying their feelings, but you are not letting those feelings take over the conversation. You are saying in a quiet way that what matters here is what was done and what was said, not just how someone felt about it. This gives the discussion a sense of fairness and structure that emotional arguments often lack. Facts also make it harder for the other person to twist the story. When you stay specific, there is less room for exaggeration or rewriting history. You are not saying, "You never listen." You are saying, "You looked at your phone while I was talking." That level of clarity makes it difficult for them to dodge the issue. They can disagree with your interpretation, but they cannot easily deny the event itself. Another powerful effect of sticking to facts is that it reduces the intensity of the conversation. Emotional language inflames, but factual language cools things down. It turns a heated argument into a problem-solving discussion. Instead of 2 people trying to prove whose feelings matter more, you now have 2 people looking at the same set of events and deciding what to do about them. That shift alone can completely change the outcome of an argument, because clarity creates space for accountability and understanding instead of blame and defensiveness. Framing your words carefully means you are not just thinking about what you want to say, but how it will be heard. In any argument, the way something is delivered often matters more than the actual content. 2 people can say the same thing, yet one creates connection while the other creates conflict. When you choose your words with intention, you guide the emotional tone of the conversation instead of letting it spiral out of control. This does not mean being fake or manipulative. It means being precise and aware of how language shapes perception. When you speak without thinking about framing, your words can come across as attacks, even when you are simply trying to explain yourself. Statements that start with "you always" or "you never" instantly make the other person feel judged, and once someone feels judged, they stop listening. But when you reframe those same thoughts into something like "what I'm noticing is," or "what I experienced was," you are still expressing yourself, but in a way that invites dialogue instead of resistance. You are keeping the focus on the situation instead of turning it into a personal indictment. Careful framing also allows you to set boundaries without sounding aggressive. Instead of saying, "you're crossing the line," you can say, "this doesn't work for me." Both communicate the same message, but one creates tension while the other creates clarity. When you frame things in terms of your needs and standards rather than their flaws, you keep the conversation from becoming a fight about character. This makes it easier for the other person to respond without feeling attacked. Another part of framing is knowing when to soften and when to be firm. Sometimes a gentle tone opens people up, and other times a clear, direct statement is what keeps things from getting blurry. The skill is in choosing the right approach for the moment. You might say, "I may be mistaken, but it seems like," when you want to lower defenses, or "this is what I need going forward," when you want to establish a clear boundary. Both are forms of framing that help steer the conversation in a productive direction. Framing your words carefully also helps you stay aligned with your own goals. If your goal is to resolve a conflict, your words should move things toward resolution. If your goal is to protect yourself, your words should reflect that. Thoughtful framing keeps you from speaking just to release emotion and instead helps you speak in a way that creates the outcome you want, because every sentence you choose either escalates the situation or brings it back to balance depending on how it is shaped and delivered. Not interrupting and allowing the other person to fully speak is one of the most underrated ways to gain power in an argument. When someone is talking, especially when they are emotional, they are revealing much more than just their words. They are showing their fears, their assumptions, their priorities, and sometimes even their insecurities. When you interrupt, you cut off that flow of information. You also send the message that you are more interested in winning than understanding, which immediately raises their defenses and pushes the conversation into a combative mode. Letting someone talk does not mean you agree with them. It means you are giving them the space to expose their position. The longer they speak, the more they clarify what they actually believe, and the more opportunities you have to see where their logic breaks down. People often contradict themselves when they talk long enough. They exaggerate, they shift their story, or they reveal emotional motives behind what they are saying. By staying silent and attentive, you give them room to do all of that without you having to lift a finger. There is also a psychological effect that happens when someone feels fully heard. Even if they are upset, being allowed to speak without interruption lowers their emotional intensity. They feel acknowledged, which reduces the urge to fight for attention. As their emotions settle, they become more open to listening in return. This creates a window where real communication can happen instead of just two people talking over each other. Silence is not weakness in these moments, it is a strategic tool. When you do not jump in, the other person often fills the space by saying more than they planned. They may start justifying themselves, backtracking, or revealing doubts about their own argument. That information is invaluable because it tells you exactly where to respond when it is finally your turn to speak, instead of guessing what they mean, because they told you. When you do respond after truly listening, your words carry more weight. You are able to address what was actually said rather than what you assumed was said. This makes your response sharper, more relevant, and harder to dismiss. The other person cannot easily accuse you of not understanding them because you gave them the space to express themselves fully. That combination of patience and precision gives you a quiet authority in the conversation that often shifts the balance of power in your favor, because you are no longer reacting to noise but responding to substance that has already been laid out in front of you. Using silence as a tool is one of the most powerful ways to control the direction of a conversation. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with silence, especially in the middle of tension. When words stop, it creates a kind of emotional pressure that makes people want to fill the space. They start talking not because they have something important to say, but because they feel uneasy. That discomfort works in your favor because it often leads them to reveal more than they intended. The more they speak, the more you learn about what they really think, what they are trying to hide, and where their argument is weak. Silence also gives you time to think. Instead of reacting immediately, you get a moment to process what was just said, to choose your words, and to decide what outcome you actually want. This pause protects you from saying something impulsive that you might regret later. It allows you to stay composed while the other person may be getting more emotionally invested in the exchange. That contrast alone shifts the power dynamic, because the person who is calm and measured always appears more confident and in control. When you stay silent after someone makes a statement, it often encourages them to elaborate. They may start adding details, clarifying, or even backtracking. This is especially useful when someone is being dishonest or exaggerating. Without interruption, they have to keep their story straight, and that is surprisingly difficult to do. Inconsistencies begin to appear, and those inconsistencies give you a clear path for asking the right questions or pointing out gaps in their reasoning. Silence also communicates boundaries without saying a word. If someone is being rude, dismissive, or manipulative, your lack of immediate response can signal that their behavior is not being rewarded. You are not feeding into their energy. You are not chasing their approval or trying to win them over. You are simply allowing their words to hang in the air, which often makes them more aware of how they sound. This can lead them to adjust their tone or soften their approach without you having to confront them directly. Another subtle power of silence is that it makes your eventual words more impactful. When you speak after a pause, people tend to listen more closely. Your words feel more deliberate and thoughtful. Instead of being just another voice in the noise of an argument, your response stands out. The quiet before you speak creates a kind of anticipation that draws attention to what comes next, giving your message more weight and making it harder to ignore in the flow of the conversation. Ending conversations with clarity rather than chaos is one of the most important yet overlooked skills in any argument. Many people leave discussions feeling frustrated, misunderstood, or exhausted because they either keep arguing until they are too emotional to think clearly or they abruptly walk away without resolving anything. Both approaches leave room for confusion, resentment, and further conflict. When you focus on clarity, you take control of the conclusion of the conversation and ensure that both sides know where they stand. Clarity is not about being harsh or rigid. It is about being precise, intentional, and deliberate in what you communicate before the conversation closes. When you end a discussion clearly, you define boundaries, expectations, and next steps. Instead of letting emotions dictate the final impression, you state what you observed, what you are willing to accept, and what you are not willing to tolerate. This removes ambiguity that often leads to repeated arguments over the same issue. By explicitly summarizing what was said, you reinforce understanding and prevent misinterpretations. People are less likely to come back later with, "But I thought you meant this," because you took the time to articulate your position clearly and calmly. Clarity also communicates confidence. It shows that you are not afraid of the other person's reaction and that you have control over your own stance. When someone senses that you are composed and decisive in how you end a conversation, they are more likely to respect your boundaries and statements. It transforms the energy from reactive tension into structured resolution, and that alone shifts the balance of power. You are no longer at the mercy of emotion or chaos. You are directing the closure in a thoughtful and controlled way. Another benefit of ending conversations with clarity is that it fosters accountability. When you clearly state what actions are acceptable and what outcomes you expect, the other person cannot easily deflect responsibility or blame. You set the terms of engagement in a neutral yet firm way that emphasizes fairness and transparency. This reduces misunderstandings and ensures that the conversation serves a constructive purpose rather than devolving into a repeated cycle of accusations and defensiveness. Ending with clarity also allows you to disengage gracefully without leaving tension unresolved. By summarizing the key points, confirming agreements, and establishing what comes next, you leave the conversation on a note of structure rather than chaos. This approach communicates that you are rational, composed, and deliberate, which makes it far less likely for conflict to continue unnecessarily. It turns potentially messy interactions into opportunities for understanding, resolution, and even respect because you are choosing to leave the conversation with intention rather than reaction. Arguing like a lawyer is not about winning every battle, proving who is right, or overpowering someone with words. It is about control, clarity, and strategy. It is about staying calm when others try to provoke you, listening to understand instead of listening to respond, and asking questions that reveal more than they conceal. It is about sticking to facts instead of getting lost in emotions, framing your words so they guide the conversation rather than inflame it, and giving the other person space to speak so you can truly understand what is happening beneath the surface. Silence becomes a tool, not a weakness, and every word you choose is deliberate, purposeful, and measured. Finally, you close the conversation with clarity, ensuring that both sides know where they stand and leaving no room for confusion or unnecessary conflict. When you master these skills, arguing stops being a battle and starts being a practice of influence, control, and intelligence. You no longer react to chaos, you guide it. You no longer chase validation, you set the terms. You no longer argue to win in the moment. You argue to shape the outcome, to protect yourself, and to move the conversation toward resolution. This is how a lawyer argues in the courtroom, and this is how anyone can argue in life with strategy, with poise, and with the quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly how to respond instead of how to react.